really honored, and it's a great pleasure to be here in one of the nicest cities of the world, and at an excellent new research place here. Yes, I would like to focus on meaning, how meaning gets into the brain. There is a problem with that because the brain has only neurons, nerve cells, and how can we make them meaningful? Well, let me mention at the start a not so happy event, but also referring back to history. My teacher and mentor died last year, Valentino Breitenberg, and I would like to dedicate this talk to him. It's, by the way, as you see from the date here on the slide, it was about a year ago, almost exactly. His contribution was to cognitive neuroscience, to cognition, to understanding cognition. He proposed a new view of the brain. Actually, he called it, you may have heard that phrase, an information mixing device, and did a lot of fine neuroanatomy in order to bolster that claim. And the idea being that this machine is actually designed to allow for linking information across modalities. So the point is that there's a lot of long-distance linkage within the brain, and this can, of course, be supported by lots of neuroanatomical investigations, long-distance cortical connections, so that it becomes possible to mix information across modalities, motor information with auditory, acoustic, visual information, because the motor neuron sitting somewhere in the motor system may receive information from the auditory system through the long-distance links and may immediately report back to the auditory system, because this long-distance connection actually, as we know, conduct activity very quickly. So his idea was that actually this machine is not very well conceived as a modular machine, but rather as something that links everything with everything and is an information mixer. So this is a bit provocative, and you may say, well, this is a bit too strong, and many colleagues were a bit opposed to such a strong statement, as they usually are. However, I would like to put some flesh on this bone, so to speak, in my talk. What are the mechanisms of meaning? Well, the classical answer is this: the mechanisms are here. Here we have a box in the middle, says the semantic system, and everybody is happy. So we have a so-called modular or boxological account. The word account is a little bit of a joke in this context. We have a display of boxes, and the idea and the statement is that here we have a system which works mainly on its own, doesn't speak so much to other systems, let alone systems for perception and action, and it's here where semantic meaning is being processed. Well, this is perhaps a nice display. It's not very explanatory. It doesn't answer the question how meaning comes about, or even how it interacts with other, how we can speak about an object in the world. But there have been theories about the semantic module should be structured internally. Semantically related concepts should be linked with each other, for example, in one account, or should share semantic features. And the idea being, again, that there's a symbolic system. Now, however, such a symbolic module has a problem. It's called the symbolic grounding problem. A person knowing the relationship between symbols among each other. So if a person can perfectly tell that this concept is very closely related to that one, well, there's still something missing. Namely, we as part of our semantic knowledge, we know to speak about the world, about the actions we do, about objects we relate to. So, and unless we do know this object and action reference of symbols, our semantic knowledge is incomplete. This is a so-called symbol grounding problem, which isn't addressed in such a symbolic module approach. Now, Precisely because mechanisms that link the semantic system to the world or to perception or action are not part of the semantic module. They are outside, so they are not, strictly speaking, semantic. Now, so if we we can state firmly that the semantic system is not sufficient to for meaning processing. So we need something else. And one approach recently is that we need a symbolic semantic system that interacts with any symbolic system. And luckily, interestingly, even those who had been defending the symbolic semantic system in the first place very strongly, they meanwhile compromise and say, well, admit that there's a little bit of interaction between language, perception, and action. However, importantly, at the theoretical level, this implies that the semantic module is dead, because a module is something that is informationally encapsulated, and if it speaks to action and perception system, then it's not a module any longer. Well, let me, however, state one thing by saying that there is a semantic system for which is whatever it means, embodied, and one which is whatever it means, symbolic. We do still not know much. What we actually want is actually a mechanistic explanation. What meaning means for specific words, for specific special cases. So, and as I will argue that for the symbolic semantic systems, this is not at all clear how such a mechanistic explanation could look like. However, for the embodied part, for the grounded part, there are at least some very concrete proposals. I would also like to dissect and to speak about in detail the mechanisms that are actually covered by, under this label of a symbolic semantic box. And I will argue that we need at least three distinct processes that could be linked to such an embodied or referential semantic system, one that is specifically targeting abstract semantic processes of the type of abstract words and abstract constructions, one that specifically links to emotional meaning and also abstract emotional concepts, and a third one, which a third section of the mechanistic part of the symbol box I would envisage to be a combinatorial semantic system, which can also be spelt out neurobiologically. And I would like to take some initial steps towards that. Now, of course, coming from a brain perspective, we want to explain even semantics based on neural laws and neural principles, such as our knowledge about the connectivity in the brain, such as the knowledge about neuronal dynamics, the fact that neurons that wire together, if they are frequently firing together. So what fires together wires together, so that the correlation of neural activation is being translated into connection strength. So if one takes such an approach, it's clear that if we hear words in the context of objects and actions, we can bind the corresponding representations together. That's very simple. However, what is sometimes overlooked is that, of course, the same correlation learning principle would also allow for linking together linguistic items. So, of course, if words, specifically pairs of words, frequently co-occur together, we would, of course, based on such a neurobiological approach, we would need to postulate that they would also link with each other, not just with an embodied object or action representation, but also with a different symbolic word representation. What we also overlook, and I will go into details about that, is that a neuron as such is not just a neuron, but it's also a logical unit, at least if one looks at it from a certain angle. This is very common in brain theory, this approach. And I would like to spell out what it means for the representation of symbolic meaning. And then, of course, there are variable ways of linking meaning aspects to words, for example, linking them to actions, to objects, but also to emotional states. But this is a little bit of a theoretical problem, which I will also go into in part of the talk. But let me start with one of these chapters at a time, and let me first speak about referential semantics. So the relationship, the grounding of symbols in the world, in objects and actions. So here, if we go back into the history of meaning science, of semantics, we get very clear and simple answers to the question, what is meaning? We get it, for example, here, even from the Middle Ages, or even Old Greek make some comments here. The idea being that there's an object and in the world, and the word or expression in the language, the symbol, refers to this object. So there's a relation. We speak about objects, and the words are the links with the objects. Now, what would this mean in brain terms? Of course, it would mean that if we have a neuronal representation for symbols, for words, which we envisage to be so-called perisylvian cell assemblies, networks of neurons that have local neuron clusters, indicated here by little circles, in the inferior frontal cortex, in motor cortex, premotor cortex, and inferior prefrontal cortex, and as well in superior temporal cortex. So here in the motor domain and inferior frontal domain, and here in the auditory acoustic domain, and in its vicinity in the superior temporal cortex. So, and this is because we learn to bind together articulatory schemes with acoustic perceptual schemes when we are learning word forms, spoken word forms. So we would envisage that the word network in the brain would look somewhat like this for the symbol itself, now still meaningless symbol, and of course spelling out the detail of such a model is a lot of work, and we have actually done ample simulation work also on this, my colleague Max Carignani especially. But I will not go into this work, but I will focus on now the question how these networks may link with meaning, and in the case of this Augustinian example where the word and the object occur together, and then the word later on is used to speak about the object. We may assume that I hear the word, I see the object, which obviously causes activation in the visual system, in the primary visual cortex, and in the inferior temporal stream of visual object processing, and the two neuronal populations, the word representation and the object representations, would co-activate and therefore bind together, so that we get a semantic network now extending from the language regions in perisylvian cortex to the visual system, towards the visual system, especially strongly developed in inferior temporal cortex. Now, this is a nice model, but it's very limited. So you may probably know from some literature that many brain language researchers locate their semantic system actually here in the inferior temporal, anterior temporal cortex. However, this approach to meaning is a bit limited, because not every word is used to speak about objects. There are other kinds of words. We sometimes use words to speak about actions, about feelings and emotions, and there are the abstract language units as well. So we need to cover those at one stage as well. Yes?
What kind of representation of code do you have in mind when you talk about this network? Is it more like a grandmother cell, or different, more population coding?
These are, well, we are using, we are fruitfully exploiting Donald Hebb's concept of cell assembly. So we are not, we are somewhere in between a grandmother cell, where a single cell would be the representing unit, and a population code where, in principle, an activation vector over the whole brain would represent the the concept or word. The proposal is that there's a set of a neural set, which is strongly connected, and the cell assembly or the neuronal assembly, and this one is the biological basis of the representation. Now, this network, when it becomes stimulated, becomes fully active because it has strong internal connections. Then, however, there needs to be inhibition between such cell assemblies, otherwise the whole brain will explode. And these are very well known neurocomputational problems, and we have tackled those, as I mentioned, in a range of simulations where we use also inhibitory mechanisms known to be present in the brain in order to make sure that these individual cell assemblies would inhibit each other to a degree and not activate all at a time. So there are sets of strongly connected networks whose activation would relate to the understanding of a word. If this is enough for the moment, I'm very happy to give a second talk on how we would actually model the details of that, which is extremely fascinating.
So for you, then it is just an activity state across a number of neural areas.
Yes.
That's in the end the meaning of a word. But now, can you draw a boundary around these areas? Would you say, and it is restricted to area A, B, and C?
The problem is that speaking about areas is not sufficient. We are speaking about neurons, neural elements, and so within one area, and even within one cortical hypocolumn, there might be several cell assemblies that draw on this part, and individual neuron, local clusters of neurons may be part of several cell assemblies. There may be an overlap between these cell assemblies.
Sure, that's all fine, but is there a boundary around this meaning area? For instance, could it extend across the whole of neocortex, or is it always restricted to these more temporal areas?
No.
Can it include subcortical areas or not?
I will get to these questions step by step. There is not a strict boundary with regard. If I have a word and I like fish and I associate with it and I link with it semantically how it smells and how it tastes and how it looks like, and finally I learn to catch a fish, I may develop connections into different parts of the cortex, also the motor system, and if the fish finally bites me, I may have a strong emotional link as well. And so there's no such restriction, and there's no strict boundary on where the cell assembly ends and where the next, and because we also have to consider the regulation of cortical activation and the regulation constants, the magnification factors of those, they determine actually whether just the core part of the cell assembly becomes active, the so-called core, or whether the cell assembly, including its halo of relatively weakly connected neurons, becomes active in a particular ignition or full activation process. So drawing a boundary is not possible because of this flexibility immanent to cortical function. So this is it looks quite simplistic, but in fact, if you simulate the details, some sophistication comes in. I'm not going to talk about these details, although it would have been a nice. I thought Max Carignani was here for. My colleague Max Carignani was here in Barcelona a year ago or so, and I thought maybe I will not give the similar talk twice.
Okay.
Anyway, now. Now, this is nice, but it's limited. There are other word types, for example, action-related words, where this object link is not very useful. Let's look at different theories of meaning. Wittgenstein, the famous philosopher of the 20th century, has stated the meaning problem and the meaning learning has framed meaning learning in somewhat different in somewhat different scenarios. Here we have an example. A child has hurt himself and cries, and then adults talk to him and teach him exclamations and later sentences. They teach the child new pain behavior. So again, child does something, expresses pain by crying, by moving the hands, changing the expression of the face. Parents see, there's this child has pain, and then have a handle on the internal state and tell the child, you have this. You can now, from now on, use this word pain instead of crying so loud. So this is an entirely different case to learning the meaning of an object in the world, learning the meaning of an object word, learning how apple relates to the object. So in this case, we have activation on the periciliary cortex when the word pain is being used, but at the same time, there's activation now, certainly in the motor system. In the motor system, insofar as certain behaviors are running, are active, and therefore the co-activation is not between visual systems and language systems, but now between action and language systems. So here we would end up with a different type of neuronal assembly, and interestingly, even different areas of the brain would be by assumption involved. And of course, this now leads to predictions that the words that look on paper very similar are in fact in the brain quite different often done. And we can put more detail into this model. We can, for example, say that even visually related words may draw on different parts of the visual cortex and the inferior temporal object processing stream, where there might be local differences between color and form related, shape related words. And also in the motor system, it's very well known that we can speak about words that relate to face movements, to movements we carry out with the hand or with a leg. And as we have somatotopic representations of these body movements along the motor strip, from bottom where the upper body parts are represented to the top where the bottom of the where the lower end of the body is represented. So it's the homunculus in the cortex is upside down, as you know, and so that we might get this activation as a reflection of the meaning even of words, such as if you look at words such as to lick or to pick or to kick. And now with such a model of semantic networks, we have, of course, a lot of work to do. We can look at brain imaging with various methods, and of course a lot has been done in this domain. We have, for example, done this experiment about the different action words, the face and the lick and the pick and the kick words. And here you see the experiment first authored by, published by Olaf Haug, a colleague in Cambridge. And here we had our subjects move their tongue, their finger, their index finger and their foot. And here we see the activation for word types that are face-related, arm-related, and leg-related. As you can see, there's sometimes substantial overlap between these activations. And there's more work done, for example, here close to Barcelona, actually, on smell words and on taste words and olfactory words, and they activate different parts of the olfactory and tactile and taste system. We have sound words, for example, where the auditory cortex is involved, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of evidence that those brain areas that process information that is relevant semantically for the meaning of these words, sound words such as telephone, the knowledge of what a telephone is, the sound, the fact that it makes sounds on special occasions is very important. Or bell wouldn't be a bell without producing a sound off and on. So meaning relevant activation can be found in different parts of the brain, and the important thing is here aspects of the semantics of the meaning, of the referential meaning of these words are reflected in the brain response. Now, this doesn't imply that the whole meaning is contained in the motor system or in the visual system or in the auditory system or in all of these single modality systems together. But it makes a very strong claim that there's a role these additional regions outside the language system, outside where the semantic system had commonly been believed to be, make also a contribution. And this is just a different review which recently appeared, now looking again also at different conceptual categories here, action, concepts, and different odor, color, and so on and so forth. This is a review of a recent review of a range of studies that looked at different action-related words, the face and the arm and the leg words. They appeared now in different. These words came from different languages, appeared either in a single word context or in a sentence context, and there were different tasks, just reading tasks or listening tasks, or then tasks where subjects had to do something with the stimuli, and this was done with verbs mostly, as you may recall. This pick and kick these word forms are more likely to be verbs than nouns. However, we have recently run an experiment now also with nouns, and we found similar differential activation along the motor strip here, for example, for food words, food nouns, which activate the inferior part of the motor strip, because you use the mouth necessarily for in the eating process. And then for tool words, we replicate previous results from Martin's group that premotor cortex at a somewhere more dorsolateral site is being activated. So there's differential activation. This is not just for verbs, this is also for nouns, and this reflects the semantics, the meaning of or some aspects of the meaning of these action-related words. Sorry? Louder, please.
A question. I have a question.
Yeah, please.
What if I just totally buy into your program? And why don't we say just that's all there is? That this is the way the words are grounded. It just seems like you're equivocating in your presentation. I just wonder what's left over. I'm thinking maybe this is because you did all this work, I believe this, but what if nothing's left over? And it's a mistake to talk about language in any other way. So it'd be more interesting if you showed us any evidence that this wasn't the case.
Sorry?
It would be interesting if you could show us any evidence where this was not the case.
Where there was some other interesting activation, not just in motor systems or sensory systems.
Language in my view, language is heavily overrated. It's just grounded in, I'm an embodied cognition person, it's just grounded in what we do.
And you would say combinatorial semantics, you can forget about it. Well, the typical argument in this case is, of course, a blind person will never understand what red means in that sense. However, if you speak to a blind person, he will use the word red almost flawlessly. There are studies on fine-grained differences in the use of color-related or visually related words in blind people. However, it works surprisingly well. And this is, of course, best explained by additional processes such as and mechanisms such as the fact, trivially, that as a blind person, somebody would, without any problems, learn that strawberries are red simply because the words occur so frequently together, and that bananas are very rarely red or never even.
But is his visual cortex lighting up when he's saying that it's red?
This is a difficult question. There is some evidence but this brings me far away from what I wanted to. speak about that. But there is some evidence generally for visual cortex activation in blind people in language processing. Neville's group has done fine work on that. However, we don't know whether this indeed reflects visual semantics. Probably not. There are general reorganization processes that just take over this part of the brain which doesn't receive the visual input anymore for other purposes, and language seems to be one of those functions that could also invade there. So I would be hesitant to make too strong conclusions here. However, I would like to go on and show you a few cases where we see activation, also semantically related activation, not in the motor system, not in the visual object processing areas or in auditory cortex. I think, and I would like to emphasize this. The understanding of this is important as well. But more.
I think it's a different question, but so I understand that your solution to the simple grounding problem is to say that activation in the language area of the brain co-occurs with activation in the movement-related or sensory-related areas of the brain, and that this is what grounds the meaning of the words.
Perception and action, yeah. So yes, it's a mechanism for the grounding.
What I worry about is that you're missing a step here, because before there is language in development, of course, children have concepts, and concepts do not require language, and animals presumably have concepts too. And is there a step of concept formation which is then linked to language in some interesting ways, so that language changes the notion of concepts, and that would fit very much with Wittgenstein's idea of language as a kind of grid which changes our perception of the world. So would there be a concept, would it be possible to separate concept representation, or to identify what's distinct about semantic representation as opposed to concept?
Well, this is a very important question. I'm far from denying that animals have conceptual processing and conceptual representation as well. Everything I said is perfectly compatible with also animals having concepts. So we would just say that that in this step, I'm dealing here with semantic learning, so to speak, linking the action concept to or the action scheme to a linguistic symbol. But the red part of the network may be as well present in an animal brain. Only the linguistic network may not, because the pericilian cortex isn't so well developed in almost all animals. So yes, there's symbol processing in animals too. Second question. Would it have a benefit? Would there be some interesting functional interaction between conceptual processing and linguistic processing in the sense of semantic distinction? The answer is yes, and the reason is well, from a neurocomputational perspective, if you have two concepts that are very similar, that overlap very strongly, and you model them as two populations of neurons that are almost identical, overlap to 90%, then it's very difficult to get them apart functionally, because when you activate one, the activation will immediately spread to the other as well. However, if you have small overlaps, you have a much easier time separating two neural representation. So if the overlap is only 40% or so, then there's a better chance of activating one without the other, given they are the appropriate inhibition mechanisms. Now, how can we get from a state where two concepts are very similar, an alligator concept and a crocodile concept, to a state where they are less similar? Well, the trick our human brain seems to have used here is to associate something very different to the two very similar concepts. So the crocodile receives an entirely different word from the other concept, alligator. So the words are magnificently different, but the concepts are very similar. And therefore, if we manage to link up these subpopulations, which is a problem in itself, however, if we manage to do that, we end up with cell assemblies with smaller overlap rates and therefore better discrimination. So the claim is, we have insufficient evidence for that, but the claim is, the interesting claim is, we do better conceptual distinctions if we link language to concepts. Anyway, thanks for the question. This is a very important question also for future research. I would suggest. And in this sense, yes, there may be a difference between semantic representations, your third question, and conceptual representations.
I mean, everything you're talking about here, you could replace the word, you could replace word with concept, could you?
Well, yeah. Well, it's of course a matter of definition. What we like to do in semantics is to speak about concepts which as very general things. The meaning of a word, semantics, we would define as that part of concepts that have a regular relationship to words. So, so there might be concepts that that are not manifest in any words, in any language, and these concepts, well, would not be covered if you speak about semantics.
So that's a very specific definition then. For you, it's really linguistically bounded.
Well, I would say it's a very specific. It's a very general, a general definition to say that semantics and conceptual processing are not exactly parallel. They are parallel to a large degree, but we would define semantic meaning as that part of conceptual knowledge that links to words and utterances.
And so as the answer to Tony then apparently is that semantics is like a subset of concepts, but that subset that links to linguistic expression.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we can leave it there.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And so so we may in this sense, well, now getting back to the red line of the talk, we have different types of semantics: action semantics, visual semantics, and this seems to be manifest in brain activation. And the grounding problem, which is of course answered by the cognitive answer, well, we know that the symbol relates to an object, relates to an action, relates to a sound. This has a brain side, a brain grounding, if you wish, in that we see modality-specific systems activation for specifically pre-selected word types, semantic word types. Now, well, there has been some discussion here. Some colleagues claimed that they couldn't replicate our semantic activations here and there. Of course, it's quite not natural that if 10 labs do a study and there are many replications, that there's an occasional failure to replicate. For example, one such failure where the authors claim that there's no semantic somatotopy, there's no motor systems activation related to meaning, but indeed in their overall ANOVA they didn't find the difference here in green and red and blue, the three word types, face and hand and foot related. And but if you actually look at their bar graphs, it's indeed true that they almost do not get any activation for the hand related words, but they use the kind of very unusual motor region of interest, which is far off from where we found this activation. And if we just look at the inferior cortex, at the inferior frontal, inferior premotor cortex, and the superior leg part of the motor strip, we see at least some numerical differences. Here the hand words are up, and here, as you see, the leg words are up, and at least in one case, this direct comparison is even significant. So they claim they couldn't replicate, but if you look at the pattern, you see at least some indication that it's not entirely the opposite of what we see. You actually see some consistency. Even if your enemy uses this kind of data in order to argue against your position, I think you're in a very good position. So they didn't want to see anything, and still there was significance. Anyway, another reason why this study didn't show very clear effects was probably because they used a block design where there's an emphasis on memory processes. So if I just listen to words for 10 seconds and then there's an MRI, there's MRI scanning throughout this period. It's not just the word recognition process we look at, as we do usually with event-related designs, which we prefer. But we look at the whole period, and most of the period, of course, is filled with people sitting there having just heard a lot of words and probably keeping in memory some of them still. And the memory processes we see in various experiments, they are not activating the motor system as clearly as the recognition processes.
So something I don't understand here now, just for understanding, okay? So you're pointing out now that you do see a difference between mouth and hand words in this area, right? So you say, I'm happy, this is what I expect.
In one case,
But if I was these authors, I would say, yeah, wait one moment, but we also see there's actually no difference with unrelated words or non-words.
Yes, absolutely.
So that means the response is non-specific, and it might be due to some bias in how the words were identified for the data set, right? So I'm not sure you're out of the woods yet.
Yeah, no, I don't want to. I don't want to claim that I can explain all the facets of their results here. There are other word types which also activate close to Broca's region, in the inferior frontal cortex. But we know from other studies that that there's a lot of motor system activation which relates to articulatory processes, to phonological processes. If we hear a sound like P done with the lips, we see activation in the lip area. And if we hear a T...
This is what I was wondering about, right?
Yeah.
Because you could basically turn it around, and somebody could say, well, why should it be, let's say, so literal, right? You could also look, whatever triggers associated responses in this area, in this topic area, shows a grounding of these words in body representation. This is all you want to say, right?
Yes.
So why take it so literal? That was a bit my concern. Why not turn it around and say, look, whatever triggers associated actions or reaction activity in the topic representations demonstrates a grounding, even though the semantic relations might be a bit obscure at this stage.
Yes. Well, in this case, it may not be any semantic representation at all, because they had also meaningless pseudo words, and therefore my comment that we also see phonologically related activation in the inferior motor cortex. For example, you probably have heard about these studies where we had subjects listen to P and T syllables starting with P or T, and there was differential activation in the inferior motor strip, in the tongue representation or the lip representation, and then D'Ausilio in Ferrara went on and stimulated these different regions and found an effect on speech perception. So that's but that's the phonological story, which
so also will not tell us about today.
No, I won't. And I'm looking slightly shocked at my watch. So
no, don't worry.
Yeah,
this is Spanish time.
Okay. Yeah. One more remark. These models, we use the fMRI cluster analysis method now to get a clearer idea of what specifically is being activated for any of the conceptual, if you wish, or semantic word types, and this made it possible for us to distinguish those areas of cortex that became active for all words alike. So those areas became active for all the words we saw. This is a reading task, therefore there was some inferior temporal activation as well. There was, and then those activation patterns that were specific to semantic categories, face words, arm words, but also, for example, form, shape-related words. And as you can see there, the networks that were activated include some motor parts here, for example. Here's some prefrontal cortex, and here this is the first time where I would like to mention. Here is very clear evidence. Activation in the motor system, okay, however, in prefrontal cortex as well. So not just sensory motor cortex, other cortices as well for these slightly abstract form-related words like square, triangle, and so on and so forth. And the important thing I want to say here is that these for our general word representation activation is very nicely Broca's and some part of superior temporal cortex, middle temporal cortex. But then our semantic network models, proposals, they are relatively simplistic compared with what we see as the pattern. So this was the model, this was the activation. So there's quite a bit not yet fully explained and covered. So even these distributed circuit models are probably not distributed enough yet and need to be further developed.
Are you going to say more about these models, or that's about it?
Which model?
Well, you said that the models don't capture the data really very well yet. You have to advance them further. That was your conclusion of the previous slide. So are you going to say more about these models, or?
Yes.
Okay.
But ask your question if you like.
Well, isn't there an inherent problem in how you model this? Because here you show grounding, and semantics is ground in action.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying, right? But your model, being disembodied, has no action. Right. So aren't you missing a really important constraint to make any, let's say, comparisons?
Sorry, I'm not following. What's the problem with the disembodiment here?
Well, the point is you say the model doesn't really capture the data very, very well.
Yeah.
The conclusion of this slide.
Yes.
And then I was saying, look, but the model just takes it as statistical regularity, okay?
Yes.
And moreover, there will be lots of these statistical regularities floating around in your brain that have nothing
Yeah.
to do with semantics. Okay?
Yes.
This model will happily pick that up. It cannot distinguish that sense, right? So
We-
it's driven by statistics, by the input statistics.
You mean the cluster analysis?
Yeah. You said the model doesn't capture this.
These networks here.
Yeah.
We need to develop these networks,
Exactly.
and we need to do things like, for example, say that of course a face-related word does not only relate semantically to the face, but also to perceiving somebody else's face, and probably this is in part this explains in part some of the temporal activation we see here.
No, that's why.
Yeah.
So it triggered a question that I was worried about earlier when you were saying something about the models you were building to describe
Yes.
this. Okay.
Yeah.
That's why I was asking whether you want to say more about the models because I don't
Not the formal models.
Okay.
Yeah.
So with respect to the formal models,
Yeah.
the formal models will try to capture this data just with respect to co-occurrence and statistical
Absolutely.
regularity,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
And I was making the point that that's not enough because if you have, let's say, other patterns of activity in this brain that are not semantically relevant, your model will still happily zoom into that. It cannot distinguish what's semantics or what's not non-semantic. And so then the question became, no, you don't think so?
I don't get this point because you can just feed it with semantic information.
Yeah, but if you feed it with nonsense and with noise, it will still try to extract some regularities because you are building these assemblies given the activity states in this network. If these activity states are nonsense, non-semantic, it will still pick them up. So,
But then there's no correlation. What should it pick up if it maps correlation?
well, but I can have correlations between, let's say, an itch in my nose and my eye twitching, right?
Yes.
That's sort of driven by the periphery. And I can pick up that correlation. And
Yep.
then in your semantic network, this would imply this is semantics, even though there's no word involved in it. So I was saying the model is sort of under constraint. It's super powerful. The other thing, well, one aspect missing is the action as such. This is a disembodied model. There's no action, so a body constraint is not there. That's one example.
There may be a misunderstanding here and there in what you say. I'm not stating that all there is a relationship between actions and linguistic symbols. So and the models as we do them, they would actually get as input a correlation pattern between a motor scheme activation and a linguistic form activation in the different parts of the network, in the perisylvian part of the network, in the motor part, or the visual part, or the auditory part of the network. So this and there would also be noise in the network, which would, according if it's statistically entirely independent, then there should not be mapping according to the correlation-like rules. But and the example of twitching and some, if this happens in correlation with as I mentioned in the context of the fish example before, if I happen to be bitten by this fish, I will suffer from some consequences in my acting with the word fish. I will certainly be more. I cannot distinguish the semantic networks which I share with you, who have never been bitten by the fish, and my own semantic network which now got this fish bite linked into it. So, unfortunately, the network would indeed then contaminate this semantic process with some other process. The hope is that because we use language in standard context and these contexts are shared among individuals, we would still have a reasonably similar representations between bitten and not bitten persons. So, but minor differences should be tolerated. So of course, whether you want to call this semantic is a big question. Probably not. It should probably be the common denominator of several brains.
Right. Well, we can get back to it then.
Yeah. Good.
Here?
Sorry? Yeah.
I have a follow-up. Do you think when you are learning these correlations, do you think that there is any special role of having a tutor, like your parent, or
I wouldn't believe that this is a very intensive interaction is of course better than an interaction which is very rare. At certain learning stages, it may be good to have very similar exemplars of the word forms or similar articulations, which are not so easily done by several different individuals. I would say both might have a role. The repetitive occurrence of very similar stimulation, as for example in repetition exercises with the same person, but then also the encountering of variability of the articulation patterns for one individual words in order to facilitate generation.
That you give special weight to the words you learn from a specific person, let's say.
Well, in this model, frequency would be a major factor, and of course if there was one particular person with one particular pronunciation pattern and this is, so to speak, hammered into the brain, this may help at an initial stage to set up a stereotypical network. It may not help the generalization processes so well.
So I'm wondering if this experiment would help Paul, and I'm wondering what you think about it. So, and you have to change this so that it gets by human subjects. But when we measure kicking, do one of your kicking measurements, but then in the same person, we have him in the laboratory, and every time he kicks the ball, we hit his fingers with a hammer. Okay? So we
I like that experiment then.
We do that repeatedly, and then if you test him later, presumably your prediction is now the hand area is going to light up.
Yes.
It'll be part of the network. But that would be sort of a, wouldn't that be rather convincing evidence? I mean, we don't, you have to think of something other than a hammer, but if we did something like that, wouldn't that be rather convincing that that it is the body parts that are being remapped here? I guess Paul's thinking he was just worried about these artificial correlations, but I'm thinking if you could control the correlations, then that would be rather convincing.
You mean that then the body part relationship could be reversed by learning?
Or extended, really. That
yes.
You just associate kicking with something bad is going to happen to your hand.
And if this was so in a community, there would not be problem to speak about semantics also. If there was a community of people who regularly hit each other on the hands when we speak about kicking, but in this experiment it would show the neuroplasticity of the networks. Yeah.
Right. That's
the freedom on cult.
Sorry.
People hitting each other with the fingers with the hammer.
Yeah.
No, but the point is, I think, making that the model is like a statistical sponge. Right? So the question is about constraints, and actually you brought in our constraint, which is, let's say, the embedding, the linguistic embedding of the sponge. Right? That's the stuff you hear from your environment, like in the Wittgenstein example, is now a constraint on that sponge. That's how you make sure you don't just suck in all possible correlations, but only those that have a linguistic relevance.
The correlation is also a filter, because if something happens only once or twice or a few times, then there's weakening of synaptic connections if these events do not co-occur many times after that. So then we may occasionally be bitten by the fish, but given that 1,000 times later there was no such biting experience, it may just die out, this connection.
Can you show that at the level of the Bolt signal? That if you just scale your action words on frequency of occurrence in the language, the Bolt signal will sort of correlate with that? If you have very infrequent action words, and you compare its Bolt signal with very frequent action words, does the Bolt signal scale with it?
Yeah. The data were not 100% convincing. We did such. There was a study first authored by Olaf Haug, published in 2008 in, I think it was Neuroimage, where we did exactly that. And there was a little spot in the motor system and also some activation in middle temporal cortex where the action words produced exactly what you said. Yes, good point. But we tried, we weren't so. There was a little bit in it, but it wasn't the most convincing data set. Anyway, now there's a discussion about these issues because, well, in brief, we have claimed that these modality-specific activations reflect category-specific semantic processing. That it's in the case of action words, the motor systems activation reflect the motor schemes, the activation of motor schemes semantically related to the words, and then the opposing proposal, the anti-proposal was, well, how do you know? It could just activate for fun, so to speak, the motor system without making any contribution, and it could be, this activation could be epiphenomenal. It could be post-understanding, just ad hoc, because people are bored in the scanner and think about well, whatever the word reminded them of, but it's not intrinsically related to understanding. So, in order to address this point, it's important to do more work, and the important questions one could address with various methods. And I think a certain openness to methods is important here, are the following. We want to know whether this activation is early or late, in the sense that understanding processes have been shown to be extremely quick processes. We see brain indicators of language understanding within 100 to 200 milliseconds. After 250 milliseconds, maybe the earliest indexes of semantic understanding have been shown. This is way before the classic N400 response, which is commonly associated with semantic processes. We believe that these early indexes of semantic processes are a better reflection of semantic access, and that the later responses, the 400, 500 millisecond responses, which also relate to semantic aspects, are of this post-understanding nature, or maybe epiphenomenal, if you want to take the term Karamazov likes to use. Now, so we want to do neurophysiological fast imaging in order to see when these motor activations, or whatever other semantic, by assumption, semantic activations come in. We also want to know to what degree these activations require that people attend to the stimuli, or whether it's actually automatic in the sense that even if they are distracted and don't really watch their input, they would also show these semantic activations. Then, of course, importantly, addressing the question of whether it activates just for fun. Well, is there a causal influence of the activation in the motor system on the understanding and the recognition of action-related words? And finally, if we really do damage or really occupy this region of the brain, the motor system, is there really a problem with action word processing, or likewise with visual system activation and visually related words? So, is it post-understanding translation or understanding itself? We can look at this. Is the activation immediate? And is it automatic in the sense that we can distract our subjects? We use, for example, paradigms where you record mismatch negativities to spoken words, where subjects are instructed to watch a silent, speechless, and language-less video film, and we record the brain responses to the words during these experiments, addressing the question whether it's automatic in this sense of not requiring a task. Here is a so to speak, the displayed video film of activations in cortex with some source localization technique from Hämmerleiner's group. This is MEG, magnetoencephalography, and we scrutinize here time step by time step, 10 milliseconds. Each picture is 10 milliseconds, and it starts about at 110 milliseconds after the words could be recognized, and the spoken words. And as you can see here on the left and right, you see slight differences. Here you see, for example, that there's slightly more activation in the lateral part of the motor strip, and down there's activation in very high up in the central cortex on the right. On the right, now the right column represents the activation elicited by a leg-related word, kick, Finnish version of kick, and on the left we have a hand and mouth-related word, eat, and they were phonologically very similar. Therefore, we chose those. So, and when we see here that the activations, the differential activations, already happen within 200 milliseconds, and we replicated this also in the range of EEG experiments and also MEG. Sorry?
I thought you said there was no language-related content in the video.
In the video, there was no language-related content, but the words were played acoustically.
Okay.
So, and subjects were instructed to watch the video film and to ignore these auditorily presented words.
What was in the video then?
Our favorite films are Shaun the Sheep and Wallace and Gromit.
Oh, right.
So, but each subject is allowed to choose their own video film, and so these are very good also insofar as there's typically no language in them. Yeah, and looking across labs and across studies, there have been a range of different paradigms used here: lexical decision, passive word reading, oddball tasks like the one I mentioned, and also semantic tasks. And in many of them, these semantic motor activations come up. Not in all of them. There have been phonological tasks with a lot of emphasis on phonological processes where these semantic activations do not seem to be very strong, at least. And there's also an influence of context more generally. Just one example here: if we, for example, embed our action-related words into sentences, here we have that bias, the understanding of the word, firstly in a noun and second in a verb sense, and then we also add grammatical information to the sentence here. For example, by adding a plural s or a third person s if it's a verb or noun, respectively. Then we modulate the activation in the motor strip. Here, this is activation of the phrases now without grammatical affixes, which where the motor somatotopy here in the motor system is actually very similar to the activations for the face and arm and leg words as we saw them for single words. So these are words in context. These are words out of context. Sorry.
Friedman, can you
so these are the old data. Yeah, and but the important thing here is by adding grammatical information to the complex sentence, we decrease these motor systems and also temporal semantic activations. Yeah, so there's modulation.
Two issues.
Yeah.
So you say, well, they're similar, but how do you quantify this kind of similarity? Because you have the amplitude of your signal, and then you have its location. And if you look at it, okay, if you close your eyes a little bit, you can say, like, they're pretty similar. But if you start with the details, actually, there's some spots in different locations. So how do you really quantify this notion of similarity?
Well, we use, for example, region of interest defined based on the early study, and if you find a significant interaction, which for the same regions, which mirrors the previous one, then we would assume that it's the same type of activation. But oops, sorry.
No worry.
Yeah. One more aspect of the context. This links up with the discussion we had over dinner last night. It's not just all the language. What determines the activations is not just the word materials and the constructions, the sentences that are being presented. Here, for example, we presented exactly the same words. These were words that related to manipulable objects, and those activated the motor strip and other brain areas, more or less dependent now on the action context of the of the language, depending on the communicative function these words had in a particular language game, if you wish. We had one context in which a subject was asked to name the object, and then the subject named the object. So this was on all this was on a video film, and in a different condition there was also an interaction, a communicative interaction between two players, where one asked the other one to give him other. Well, the first question here was, what can I give you? What do you want? And then the other one said, well, this and this object. And then the other one handed over this object. In this second context, where a request is being made now with exactly the same word, it was words like scissors and the lamp or candle, and there was real interaction with the objects. So they were either being pointed to or handed over, and this all this was presented to an experimental subject in the chamber, in the MRI or in the EEG chamber, And we saw here markedly different brain responses to exactly the same words. And as you can see here, the EEG data showed very clearly a much stronger brain response already at 120 milliseconds in the request context compared with the naming context. And the fMRI activation showed here some motor systems activation, broca and premotor cortex, which is also confirmed by the source localization of the EEG. So it's not just the words, even not just the sentences or the tasks. It's actually the communicative embedding or the pragmatic function of the words they have in their communication context that determines motor systems and is reflected in motor systems activation. Next question. Now, is there a causal effect? Is there, if we hit the motor system now, would there be a problem, or would there be an effect on recognition of action-related words? This is an old study, 2005, published publication date. Here we stimulated with TMS the hand region or the leg region and found a slight facilitation of hand or leg word processing with stimulation. There was a causal influence, such causal influence influences have been replicated by a range of studies. For example, Luzzi and others in current biology recently, they used direct current stimulation and found an effect on action word learning. Now, going on about this causal effect issue, is there really a problem if the motor system goes? We can look at lesions in the motor system, for example, here a very small one, and ask whether patients who actually do quite well with language, but still may be impaired in some way. We can investigate them in linguistic tasks now checking whether they do as well with action-related words as they do with other words. And the surprising result was that they may show a category-specific problems. Here in this study done by Bettina Neininger, my doctorate students from Konstanz still, she found a problem with action-related words, so very, very high error rates, reduced number of correct responses in a lexical decision task on action-related words when there was a lesion now in the motor system, and this was even so for motor system lesions affecting the right hemisphere. So it's enough to have a stroke affecting the right hemisphere's motor system to show a problem in such lexical decision tasks, specifically for action-related words. Now, there are claims about general semantic areas. For example, the most famous of them is, and this addresses your comment from before, the most famous of these general semantic areas is the temporal lobe. And we know that the most severe semantic deficit known to date, so-called semantic dementia, arises when there's bilateral lesion, the bilateral degeneration of this temporal pole. And this is a very impressive progredient disease where indeed semantic problems are in the foreground, conceptual and semantic problems. So it already comes up in non-linguistic experiments. For example, if they have to keep in mind object pictures for a while, they can reproduce after a short delay quite well, but after a delay they may produce something very different, and they may retreat to an average animal, in this case, for example, a duck with 4 legs at the top, at the upper right. So very interesting syndrome. And however, the claim had been that in this case there's a semantic systems lesion, and therefore there should be no category differences. All words should be affected alike. Now, this is a little bit in contrast with Tim Schellis's data from the 80s, where he reported patients with herpes simplex encephalitis affecting also inferior temporal, anterior temporal cortex, and found strictly category-specific deficits of tool or animal words. And we therefore looked into this issue once again, now comparing, for example, arm and face-related words, assuming that if this disease is indeed starting here in temporal pole and then spreads to inferior parts of frontal cortex, it should affect the semantic networks of the face words before it gets to the arm-related words, and likewise it should affect the color words. Using our model of color and form word processing, should affect the form, the color words earlier than the form shape related words. And this is exactly, as you can see here, what we found in the study of early semantic dementia patients. So it's not correct that all categories are affected alike. But it's still true, probably, that the anterior temporal cortex has a general role in semantic processing. Whether this is semantic processing in the sense of a symbolic semantic system, or whether it's this part of the brain rather provides the power station or input from subcortical structures, channels the input from subcortical structures to cortex that is necessary for conceptual processing, we do not know with certainty. One more study, you may know that I'm a drummer, and in this case I managed to connect a hobby and my passion with my job, and we taught our subjects drumming in this case, and we had them learn a complex motor pattern called a paradiddle, and I'm happy to show you in the break how this works. And we taught them to do this either with the hands or with the feet, and then we taught our subjects even more. We had them also we had them memorize lists of words which were either hand or leg related, and guess what happens? There was an impairment of a modality-specific or effector-specific impairment of action word memory, such that when they performed the drumming pattern with the hands, they did less well with the hand-related words than with the leg-related words, and vice versa when they did the drumming with the legs. So this is another piece of evidence that the motor system is not just active for fun in the processing of action-related words, but it plays a functional role and makes a contribution. Another topic now done by my doctorate student Rachel Mosley. The last one was by Zubaida Shabani, who graduated last month in Cambridge, and Rachel Mosley, who is in her second year, she did a study now on autism, and here there's an idea that there's a motor system problem in autism, and we actually asked whether there's activation of motor systems in autism now for action-related words or object-related words, and you can see here the red activations are for the action-related words. This is in the motor system. This is now missing for action verbs in the autists. So no red in this, not much red here in the motor system. And interestingly, we also could document a problem, a behavioral problem in semantic classification of action-related verbs in a behavioral task. So they had indeed a semantic problems. This is the first time such a semantic categories deficit is documented in autism. So and there was even a relationship between the degree of semantic problem and semantic activation in the motor system. I think this is so far the strongest piece of evidence we have that there's indeed a crucial role of motor system activation now in semantics.
Right, so because in the autist brain, the ratio of long and short range connections is different, yes, compared to the healthy brain.
Yes.
Because the long-range interactions are compromised.
Actually,
So
exactly. That's also the approach here of the explanation.
Then you could say this is a sort of a non-specific consequence of that general problem of connectivity that will be expressed in many different functional aspects. So it's not specific to semantic processing of action.
Sure not. Yeah, it's very well known that autists have motor problems.
That's fine for you as well. You don't want
absolutely.
To say this. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. We are never claiming that everything is contained in the semantic system. Of course, the semantic system, in this sense, is action perception based,
and it suffers in an equal way. This is the point.
And the well-known fact that most autists have indeed motor problems, something which is ignored by many colleagues. They really have motor problems, coordination problems, very common, of problems with fine motor movement, and here we see problems in cognitive activation of the motor system and in semantic processing of motor action-related words. This fits together very nicely, and it's not by no means just a linguistic problem. It's just the linguistic experiment is very nice because it shows the link between action perception circuits and the higher cognitive functions, so meaning processing. So that's why I mentioned it here. And so we have actually 4 out of the 4 possible points. There's immediate activation, there's automatic activation, at least in the sense that this activation comes about even in tasks where no attention is required. It's not true. It's not automatic in the sense that this activation is not modified by context, as I showed. For example, the speech act context modifies it. It's also functionally relevant, and if the motor system goes or is impaired or is disconnected, as many believe now for autism, then we see a functional impairment, for example, in semantic, especially in semantic processing of action-related words. Yeah. Now, I should say that I've been talking 1.5 hours with all the questions about, not quite, and I have still a few more slides to go, and I would like to talk to the boss about what your advice is, how to go further. No. What I can offer is a little.
I guess you're moving now towards your conclusions, no?
Well, no, actually, as you see here, starting the first quarter is over, and there are 3 more parts to capture. There's a part on combinatorial semantics, there's one on emotion semantics, and there's one on abstract semantics. I suggest that you vote.
Well, look, give us your most impressive highlight of these 3.
Well, I'm far from self-praise, but if I had to,
what makes you beat your drums faster?
Drums faster. Well, this would be a sign of a bad drummer. If you become faster in drumming, this is what you must not do. So
depends what the rest of the band is doing, right?
Irrespective of what they're doing, they can say, yeah.
Okay, so you really want us to choose for you?
Yes.
Okay. Good.
I would suggest that you just vote. Otherwise, I would probably just go on with the emotional semantics. I would go
on. I think the combinatorial one we should jump to.
Huh?
Show us the combinatorial semantics one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So sorry. Yeah. So we can of course ask. We have a certain knowledge about strawberries being red, and that certain words combine with other words, and this is not embraced by the grounding idea. This is something different. This is, as we sometimes say, word-word correlation rather than word-world correlation. So, but however, if the brain is indeed an information mixing device working, obeying the correlation learning principle, it should not be at all a problem for it to map these co-occurrence probabilities of words in sentences or in texts. And mapping these co-occurrence probabilities is also the approach, the better or more explicit and more worked out semantic approaches of these disembodied schools would favor. For example, in Landauer's approach, there's the statistics are being done about words co-occurring with other words in larger pieces of text. And as a function, and the semantic vector for each word is then a consequence of the co-occurrence probabilities of the words in texts. So now, how would the brain do this? And we have tried to do very elementary initial simulations addressing this possible this question. Now this is now simulation work done with my colleague Andreas Knoblauch, who is now at Honda Europe in Offenbach next to Frankfurt, and the idea was here, of course, that we provide a substrate for these word representations to link up with each other, and to link it to constructions or longer sequences of words. And we made our job easy. We just presented our network with word pairs, and the network had this structure. We used an auto-associative network where sequence detectors were pre-wired, so that each of these so we had one input layer where our words, our I words, were represented, and then all the possible combinations of pair sequences of these words were represented in this square matrix, auto-associative matrix. So this neuron here, or this neural element, was sensitive to word number 1 followed by number 2. This one for the reverse sequence, and so on and so forth. So we had n words and I words and n words and to the n by n sequence detectors here. The interesting thing now was that it was as I said, an auto-associative network where in this sequence detector area, every neuron was every neural element was connected to every other one. So there was not only the possibility to map the occurrence of words that occur together, but there was also the possibility to link together the information about which word pairs were frequently were related to each other. So let me make you a simple illustration here. We just take a mini vocabulary of nouns and verbs, and here you can from a fairy tale text. And just a training example, and here you can see that some of the nouns co-occur with some of the verbs, and sometimes this co-occurrence matrix is quite dense, and then there are other parts where there's not so much exchange and mutual substitution. Now, what the network does, if presented with this data, it links together not only the word representations here in gray and the sequence detectors, but it also, after a while, because this word pair, this noun followed by this verb occurs, activates this sequence detector, but then if this word activates together with a different verb, then there's a little bit of activation of this node as well. This one activates very strongly, but this one a little bit too. So those two would start to bind with each other. And after a while of presenting these substitutions, this substitution pattern, we get a neuronal assembly here in this auto-associative layer, which actually becomes active whenever a word from this group here comes up, and which also links to all the possible successor words. So this network now does a degree of generalization, such that if there's a pair of word which was never in the input, Here, for example, this word would never have occurred together with this verb here, but still, after activation of the of this word here, the never previously occurred word together with this word would be primed through this sequence detector assembly. We therefore call these networks that form in this type of network, these circuits that form in this kind of networks, combinatorial neuronal assemblies. And from a linguistic perspective, this is very interesting because this network does exactly what one would hope in a linguistic context where there are rules that generalize over individual items. So we get for free with this approach that a group of words can be linked to a different group of words, and it doesn't matter so much which individual member. So we may be able to use this network to generate, with a little bit of noise on top, to generate new sequences of words. And this is not yet interesting for semantics, but now it becomes, because if we now use a slightly more sophisticated set of words, where the words are indeed semantically related to each other. Here, for example, we have nouns that all relate to living beings. Down there, we have nouns that relate to flying objects, including some living beings. And as you can see here, if we map the sequential probabilities as we get them here now, not from a fairy tale. There's a mistake here in the heading. This was from the British National Corpus with its 100 million words. And if we now put in these co-occurrence probabilities here, we get a mapping of subsets of nouns to subsets of verbs. And those indeed follow semantic criteria. They, for example, link together the semantically related living beings and also the semantically related flying objects. So we have here a little bit of disembodied manifestation in the neural network of semantic categories. These are combinatorial categories not related to the action and object information, because we just we deprived this network entirely from any action or object information. It was just the combinatorial, syntactic, if you wish, but also semantic, as you see, information, and the network, based on correlation learning, produced representations that generalized and that respected semantic category boundaries. So the conclusions from here would be that these discrete combinatorial neuronal assemblies, that they can store constructions which actually bind together word-related neuronal representations, and they would, for the formation of these flexible binding units, it's very important to have the recombinatorial information that words are substituted with semantically similar words in similar contexts, and the important observation is that that these networks bind together not just syntactic categories, not all nouns to all verbs, but there's a degree of semantic subclassification where living beings, flying objects, and so on, ad hoc semantic categories can be are being subgrouped. And then, of course, interesting from a linguistic perspective is, of course, the ability to generalize, and to generalize in a semantic category-specific manner. Yeah, so we have here a way of approaching from a neurobiological and correlation learning perspective, this problem of a combinatorial semantic system, and of course it is indeed networks of this sort with extensions to motor systems, to visual systems, to auditory systems that should be considered individual word representations here in this abstract combinatorial network. So the combinatorial network in itself, of course, suffers from the symbol grounding problem as any other combinatorial approach. However, if these individual representations, the word representations and construction representations, if they are grounded in action and perception systems, then we have a basis of such combinatorial modules, if you wish. It's not modular in any sense. However, it's in fact grounded in these action perception circuits, but the type of linkage is indeed very similar to what some of the symbolic combinatorial approaches would claim, however, now with a neuroscientific foundation. Right. Or if you want me to say really a final, give you a final wrap up here. So the general proposal remains that there's grounding of symbolic semantic systems in action and perception circuits, and that this symbolic semantic system is actually grounded in this information mixing device. And how to spell out the theory in more detail is now a topic of a program which interestingly we called Babel, which is a bio-inspired architecture for brain embodied language, and I hope we will still be able to make some sense out of these neuromechanistic approaches in the context of complementing what I show here in diagram form by more elaborate neural models which potentially could go on robots at one stage. There's a little bit of robot work which I could have mentioned together with from our previous EU project with Stefan Welter and the Parma group, but I skipped this. Maybe we can speak about this in discussion. So some aspects of these semantic networks are actually modeled in neural networks and have been brought on the so-called Mirrorbot robot, but the general approach is action perception circuits are driven by correlated neuronal activation and neuroanatomical links. It makes it possible for us to link, for example, at the very basic level, the knowledge about how to articulate a word and the knowledge about how to perceive a word. The word form grasp, for example, as a spoken unit and as a heard, as an acoustically perceived unit, and we have this sensory motor action perception network in pericilium space. Over and above this, we have other processes. One of the processes, of course, is the linkage between such action perception circuits, the word form network in pericilium cortex, and semantic networks, and for example, extending into the action domain of cortex. But then, as a further feature of the model, these action perception circuits are being linked with each other in a combinatorial sense, and this is mainly going on in certain parts of the pericilium cortex. So, as our model says, primarily in prefrontal and peripheral higher temporal cortices. So this is the general approach, and it's now my great pleasure to thank many of my collaborators, most importantly Zubeida Shabani's work has been featured, and Veronique Boulanger's has not, I'm sorry, has been cut out. And I mentioned some work by Francesca Carota, and by Rachel Mosley as well, and of course Olaf Haug and Juri Styrov and Max Carignani are my collaborators now for many years in Cambridge, and to a degree Max Carignani now in Berlin as well. I thank you very much for your attention and apologize for the long speech.
All right, Prima. Thank you very much. Great talk. So time for some questions. Dimitrios had a new record running through the room. Questions?
Hello. Thanks for a great talk. And I know you have also designed constraint-induced therapy for people with aphasia, right? And if I understand it correctly, part of that is that they are not allowed to make gestures during their therapy. And how do you ground that in this idea you have of the motor system being connected in semantic understanding?
This is a constraint-induced aphasia therapy is a term we once used. We now prefer to use the same method, intensive language action therapy, just to be more clear about the theoretical foundation. And it is indeed correct that we have written that that we would prefer it if subjects would focus on verbal utterances, and it's not encouraged in this context that subjects refrain from speaking, but rather gesture instead of speaking. However, I have been pointing out many times is that by no means should we prevent subjects from gesturing. So of course, we know that there are the reason for going for this approach is the knowledge about the close functional interaction between language and action systems. So the idea is the action system with an aphasia, with a stroke, there may be a lesion in the linguistic system, in the perisylvian cortex, and because language is intrinsically linked to action systems, the still to a degree intact action system may actually help a partially impaired linguistic system by sending activation and completing neuronal patterns. So we do not actually want to prevent acting in context of speaking. Quite the contrary, we want to encourage this. What we, however, want to prevent is that people stop to speak and just gesture, because that wouldn't help the improvement of the verbal skills, which is the main idea of many approaches to language rehabilitation. This is also what patients usually are after. They want to speak and communicate rather than just gesture in everyday life. So these game-like interactions we have created in the context of intensive language action therapy and constraint-induced aphasia therapy, the patients will only be successful in these interactions if they communicate verbally, but they can, and this is actually encouraged, also use gestures to prime themselves and to help their articulation and to provide complementary information, but please not replace verbal action by just gesturing. This is the.
Thank you.
Next question, Luis.
I wanted to ask about the grounding. So I have the feeling that the sort of language community always starts from sort of top down. So now we have the symbols and we need to ground them. So I was wondering if I'm like an embodied agent that goes through development, I always acquire my language basically, or first my concepts, then perhaps my language in a bottom-up fashion. So basically the symbols would kind of emerge. So is this the best perspective to start from the symbols and have the sort of urge to ground them? Because I think that there's no way that they cannot be grounded in an embodied developmental agent, I have the feeling. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't fully follow.
Okay, so
you're talking about an agent, a robot, for example.
Yeah, or me.
Sorry.
Or it, or it can be a human, right? But basically, if you go through development and you start like from the sensory motor level, and then gradually some symbols would kind of emerge that then basically they can be connected to language, but there's no. I don't see any point where they cannot be grounded. So why do we talk always about the grounding problem if it's a human that goes from bottom up?
Still, I see. I'm not fully clear what you're after. But so let me just say we're. So there's sensory motor learning, and this sensory motor learning, action perception learning, that results in the representation of a symbol. At a very early stage, the robot or a human would produce random syllables like ba 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 ba, because something comes out of the mouth and is being fed back to the ears, and then there is correlated activation in motor systems and in auditory systems, and a cell assembly develops. So there you have your first representation of a symbol, if you wish. At a later stage, we can link this to other sensory motor representations. For example, the sensory motor representations that develops when I randomly grasp objects. So the grasping concept may be linked to a certain syllable, namely the syllable grasp. So and then we develop the first semantic networks based on symbol networks for the word form grasp, which we have produced before, and these sensory motor concepts, if you wish, which we developed because there was, in parallel to the babbling, there was also some random activity and occasionally a grasp.
Right. Yeah.
So that would be the grounded start of conceptual representation, linguistic representation, and the link between the two.
Right.
Is this clear? I'm not sure how to apply the words bottom up or top down. Where is the top and where is the bottom?
Maybe to continue the discussion in the break, okay?
Yeah.
So Louis, last question.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I just wanted to we didn't have time to abstract semantics. Maybe if you can, or maybe later, say 2 words about what did you want to say with X or neurons. So how did you represent abstract semantics?
Yeah, you could just say, well, why don't you present the other 2 parts of your talk?
No, it's just semantics.
I'm very happy to.
I mean,
I'm sure you are.
No. It's just what's very immense because I would have wondered if you present the number 2 or the number 5, what regions of the brain activate, if there are some difference or when do they some calculations or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. Abstract. Very brief. 2 slides. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we get these activations which are distinctively non-sensory motor, but still related to meaning. So that was your question before, and I think there's now double reason to show this. Here, for example, comparing an idiomatic to a literal sentence, we see a very clear difference if we say the sentence about catching a ball in green and catching the sun. Catching the ball, catching the sun. Everything the same, only the last word is different. In one case, it's a literal sentence, and in the other case, it's an idiomatic expression. So you think, you do not actually think of catching in this sense, but you lie in the sun and feel fine, and you do not much. So still, there's a clear and pronounced and early, interestingly, very early, around 100 to 200 millisecond difference between these type of sentences, which does not occur if we just compare ball and sun to each other. So we made sure that this is not the case, and in this study. So this seems to be related entirely to this abstract idiomatic nature of the abstract sentence. And the activations here, they are not in motor systems, they are not in auditory systems, they are in prefrontal cortex, they are in anterior temporal cortex. So in those regions which are certainly multisensory and which some people would like to see a symbolic semantic system to be housed there. Now, now how? But we still need to explain why some of these abstract processes are indeed moving to away from the sensory motor systems, and it's very well known that neurons can do things like computing either-or relationships.
But
This
can
is.
Can you just interject a tiny note of protest? Is that when you have these sentences in context, the time difference is enormous, and what you have time to go through the basal ganglia 3 or 4 times, and so the network that evolves in the cortex is a completely different network than you would if you just have this sort of static presentation. It just seems that there's this old-fashioned idea that the cortex codes places, and that you can publish papers endlessly in fMRI by just lighting up these different places in different circumstances. But it's actually in the languaging very dynamic. So the sentence in context it activates the brain in an entirely different and more complicated way than the words in situ. It's just a tiny note of protest. I love
This is a very general observation. So I just chose this example of a. You're right. There's an idiomatic sentence, and it is a complex unit, and we need to consider many different processes, not just the single word meaning, and it's a longer process. However, what I'm saying here is that this semantic related activation outside sensory motor system, this happens within 100, 200 milliseconds after the onset of this critical word ball and sun in this example. So it's rather quick. Or do you disagree with my statement that 150 to 200 milliseconds is quick?
Well, there's lots of 50 to 100 is your basic time constant, so you have time enough for a couple of it's very fast, as you said.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of work by Mike Tannenhaus with eye movements that show that the eye movement system is locked to the speaker's sentence right down to those kinds of time periods.
Yes.
And so the processing is the successful processing of the sentence is very, very fast, and certainly within these limits.
Yes.
So it's not a static cortex if you're going to give it 200 milliseconds.
Yeah. Well, I cannot help it if there are more questions. I just choose this sentence example because it's our latest publication, and but for single words. We see exactly the same thing here. For example, a study by Beiner. It's also dorsolateral prefrontal cortex defines, or in a study we haven't actually published yet, and also by Catholic Price. It's anterior inferior frontal cortex that relates to abstract meaning processing of single words in this case. So it seems though the common finding is there are regions outside sensory motor cortices that contribute or that become active in abstract semantic processes. So why is that? Why does it move out the sensory motor domain? Couldn't we say all semantics is in motor cortex, in auditory cortex? No, it's not. Why? And one reason could be that if we think of abstract concepts and likewise abstract constructions, in fact, something like I kick the idea or I grasp the idea is actually something very similar to a big word, a construction which I store with a meaning paired to it, and these abstract items, be they word or constructions, they may just draw on on a range of very different sensory motor patterns, schemes. For example, in the case of an abstract word like to free, we may have instantiations of freeing, and when I learn what freeing means, I may learn that you can do this by unlocking handcuffs, by opening and unlocking a door, or by just saying as a judge, you are now free. So there's a range of very different motor, more primitive motor schemes that go through as freeing in specific contexts. So what we want to have here is a device to say, well, either that one or that instantiation or that typical prototypical instantiation, then you get freeing. And this can be done by either or circuits, and it's very well known that neurons are just cut out for calculating such logical operations. If you don't know that background without going into details, there's a very important, interesting paper by McGilloch and Pitts from '43, actually, a logical calculus of ideas immanent to nervous system activity, and the corrected version thereof by Klein a little later, based on such neural function, which is focusing on single cells, but would apply for larger neuronal units as well. One could model such anterior shifts of abstract meaning processes. This is very roughly the idea. And now, of course, the important question becomes how the two processes, these more abstract, these more removed processes, the difference between kick the idea and kick the ball in prefrontal cortex would relate to the embodied processes, because then the Karamazzian proposal was, well, there's a symbolic system and this just drives everything in sensory motor systems. But we looked at that. We looked at sentences such as grasp the idea and kick the habit, which have action connotations because there are action words included in them, and we see a dissociation in now again triggered. The trigger is here the disambiguating last noun, idea or habit. And we see the dissociation here. We see the dissociation here between motor systems activations. We see so the arm sentences activate arm representation. The leg sentences, even if they are abstract, activate the leg representations, but not. But just yeah. And this happens exactly at the same time, between 150 and 200 milliseconds, as this difference between idiomatic and literal. So this is what I think
the idea is clear. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Freeman.
I'm so sorry.